We're going to discuss Rabbi Lamm's view on marriage, sexuality, and family. It's our fifth class. And before we begin, I still want to begin with words of eulogy, because it's important that one continues to eulogize so long as one feels the sadness and the pain. And I still feel the sadness and the pain of Rabbi Lamm's passing. And today I want to talk a little bit more about one of the four attributes I've noted in Rabbi Lamm's public persona. He's an author, he's a religious leader, he's a communal leader, a visionary communal leader, and he's an intellectual diplomat. And I want to focus for a minute on the fourth attribute that I perceive as very central to Rabbi Lamm's public persona. Rabbi Lamm, I think, genuinely believed in the idea that when multiple truths are presented, that is by definition an indication that none of the truths are fully correct. And successful people either pick one of these truths and live with it while acknowledging in their heart that other truths might also be correct, or they become an intellectual diplomat, a person who synthesizes a compromise among the different views that is starkly non-ideological and recognizes that the truth is hard to discern, and the middle position, the position that's frequently least well supported by the text, because the texts tend to generate extreme analytic positions, is probably the closest position to truth. And this is a very important intellectual idea, because we live in an era where compromise is a dirty word, and compromisers are dirty people. But I think Rabbi Lamm lived in a world where compromise was not just politically wise, but it was a moral truth reflecting the fact that the right outcome was somewhat ambiguous in lots of hard cases. And it was intellectually prudent to acknowledge the possibility that another view that also is venerated is correct. And this intellectual compromiser doesn't come from weakness of thought, and it doesn't come from a lack of a backbone. It comes from a much deeper idea, which is classical old disputes cannot be resolved intellectually, and either you have to do your thing while acknowledging their thing is correct, or craft a position that takes into account the multiple possible truths out there, and you craft a practice that is not found in the earlier sources, but takes a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and puts together a combination special reflecting your intellectual humility and your sense of compromise, which is that we want to do things in a way that reflects the sense that we actually might not know the truth. We actually might not know the truth. And this idea is important. Today, we're going to touch on, we're going to do more than touch. Today, we're going to talk about Rabbi Lamm's two profoundly important works on marriage, sexuality, and family. And they're two profoundly important works that span an 8-year period. In 1966, Rabbi Lamm published A Hedge of Roses. And in 1974, Rabbi Lamm published in the Encyclopedia Judaica supplement an elaborate article on homosexuality. And both of these articles allowed Rabbi Lamm to lay out his vision of marriage, sexuality, and family. To this day, a hedge of roses is still a standard gift you give to newly married couples, reflecting the fact that Rabbi Lamm not only outlined the traditional Jewish view of marriage, he placed it very well in the 20th century. I have no doubt that there'll be a time in the future where the hedge of roses is passé, in the sense of it's not a timeless book, it's a timely book. Rabbi Lamm works very hard in the hedge of roses to confront modern times. We are still living in those modern times. Rabbi Lamm lays out here a very basic intellectual construct. Rabbi Lamm recognizes at the time that he's writing a deep understanding of the revolution that we're starting to confront. I admire him very much just because if he published the book in 1966, it means he must have written it in 1963 or 64. And the sexual revolution is just getting started. But Rabbi Lamm deeply grasps the challenge that the sexual revolution is going to pose to the Orthodox community. He grasps that hedonism poses a challenge to Judaism in the 20th century and in the 21st century that's more serious and more powerful in the 20th century than the Catholic Church. The things that ailed Judaism and that caused people to stop being Jewish 1,000 years ago, Rabbi Lamm recognized in A Hedge of Roses aren't present anymore. Religious Jews do not wake up one morning and decide to become Catholic or Muslim. And by the 1960s, Rabbi Lamm is already intuiting that Jews are not apostatizing out because of discrimination. And by 1967, Jews were proud of their Jewishness, and people weren't leaving Judaism because it's better to be a Unitarian. Those were all models of a different time. Rabbi Lamm understands in The Hedge of Roses that hedonism poses a very basic challenge to religious life. It argues that people's purpose in this world is to experience pleasure in its many different ways and many different facets, and attempts to restrict our access to pleasure in the name of good behavior or proper morality or interpersonal courteousness or tradition, the hedonistic view of life was not going to tolerate. And not only that, it was going to frontally and directly challenge the Torah's view of sexual ethics. And Rabbi Lamm gets that right. He understood that that was the challenge that was being posed. And he attempts to formulate a response. Before I go on to discuss Rabbi Lamm's response, I just want to give the man bonus points. You get bonus points in this universe when you're the first person to understand the problem and you're the first person to start the process of formulating a solution. And Rabbi Lamm figures out before anybody else The era of anti-Jewish polemics by the Catholic Church is over. The era of street-wide anti-Semitism is over. The universe that he grew up in and my parents grew up in which anti-Semitism was acceptable and Jews left Judaism because they were uncomfortable being victims of anti-Semitism, wasn't going to continue. And that the great challenge to us was going to come from a basic secular morality, which said you were put on this earth to experience your own happiness. And anybody who tells you you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that because your religion is against it, you should shrug them off and say, I was put on this world to make me happy. Rabbi Lamm, by the way, hints at this in our last class when we dealt with extraterrestrial life, which is, without directly saying it, Rabbi Lamm says the basic undergirded view of the people who want to present Earth as just a spot in the universe with no godliness is to argue part of the hedonistic revolution, which is there's no point in being a good person because we're just a speck out there, and really there is no God and we don't care. This continues Rabbi Lamm's insistence, and this is a deep source of bonus points of actually discussing the hard problems that we are really confronting. Many of the Torah giants in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s did an excellent job of discussing the wrong problem because they were still living in Europe in 1930, or they were living with Nazism in the 1940s, and they spent an enormous amount of time discussing the wrong problem. Rabbi Lamm, by the mid-1960s, has stopped discussing the wrong problem. Many others, even some leaders to this day, are doing a fantastic job fighting the wrong war with the wrong enemy at the wrong time in the wrong place, to paraphrase Omar Bradley. Rabbi Lamm is fighting the right war at the right time with the right people, and he even has a pretty good set of weapons. And Rabbi Lamm figures out that the sexual revolution is posing a challenge to the very structure of Orthodox Jewish life, and he writes two things about it. First and foremost, Rabbi Lamm is a sympathetic skeptic to the claims of sexual liberation. What do I mean by that? Rabbi Lamm understands that there's a basic Jewish truth to the idea of sexual pleasure and bliss. By the way, if you want to see a contemporary of Rabbi Lamm who comes to the same conclusion, both Rabbi Lamm and Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein come to the same basic conclusion, which is something was lacking in some parts of rabbinic Judaism in that they diminished the idea of even sexual pleasure and bliss in a marital arrangement. And both Rabbi Lamm and Rabbi Lichtenstein stopped at various times to note that we need to have a more positive attitude towards marital sexuality and marital bliss, and that the idea of being being sexually content is of some value and is somewhat important. But he's skeptical of the following idea. He's skeptical of that this is the solution to a real problem. Instead, Rabbi Lamm tells people that the core values of hedonism, the core of the values of hedonism are not about a marital tranquility and sexual bliss within a marriage, which Rabbi Lamm in A Hedge of Roses deeply endorses. And he comments on both positively as a matter of theology and positively as a matter of halakha and positively as a matter of proper social norms. But Rabbi Lamm recognizes that the core of hedonism is a much deeper argument, which he wants to stop and reject. The core argument that Rabbi Lamm wants to reject is the hedonistic argument that I'm not a creature of God and that I wasn't put on this earth to be a watchman for God. And this is consistent with my basic read of an undergirded principle that Rabbi Lamm believes in. Rabbi Lamm believes that the central question that you need to ask when you encounter important moral questions is, as God's agent, what am I supposed to do? And Rabbi Lamm intuits that hedonism is not an argument that as God's agent, I should have some aspect of marital bliss and sexual pleasure, because Rabbi Lamm agrees that that's right. And not only does he agree that that's right, he acknowledges that there's a distinct Jewish law tradition that says that way. It's not the only such tradition, but it's a distinct, viable tradition. Rabbi Lamm's point, though, is that the hedonistic view that's starting to be created in the 60s is driven by the following idea. I am the only person who counts in this world, and my pleasure is the only thing that's important. And he says the same thing here that he says in environmentalism. And it's the same thing he says in a few other areas, which is it's the antithesis of the Jewish tradition to say to yourself, I am the focus of what I'm supposed to do, and if it makes me happy, then that's good enough. Rabbi Lamm wants to put the hedonistic tradition that he's encountering in the 60s and the 70s in the same place that he wants to encounter all of the ideologies which, as their starting point, deny that we are God's creatures on this earth. And so while he's prepared to recognize there's a hedonistic virtue, and he's prepared to recognize that that hedonistic virtue within a marriage even has a place in the Jewish tradition, he's not prepared to recognize the undergirded ideology, which says everybody is entitled to pursue their own pleasure independent of consequences. And Rabbi Lamm's point here is that this hedonism is going to create enormous challenges to our community, because it's not that it disagrees with the detail of the Jewish tradition. It's that it disagrees with the basic religious orientation of rabbinic Judaism. And let me contrast this with Rabbi Lamm's writings on homosexuality. Because Rabbi Lamm's writings on homosexuality are the other part of his writings on marriage, sex, and family. And here, Rabbi Lamm puts forward a very different view. And I uploaded the article for you to read. Rabbi Lamm in the early 1970s does something that is very much reflective of how Rabbi Lamm wanted to view this. Rabbi Lamm writes in a very controversial article that still reverberates around the community that the Jewish tradition should treat homosexuals and homosexuality with compassion and not treat the Orthodox Jewish homosexual, or even the committed homosexual who's also seeking religion, as a person who needs to be excluded from the community, but rather we should do our very best to find a way to welcome this person in the community, so long as they're prepared to live with the fact that their observance is incomplete. Rabbi Lamm then says something that many people didn't like, which is he thinks that the psychiatric labeling of homosexuality as an illness is a positive step. It's really very out of play in the 21st century. But Rabbi Lamm says as follows: the Jewish tradition is very comfortable with the idea that many different people in many different settings are incapable of observing Jewish law completely properly. Sometimes because of illness, sometimes because of duress, sometimes because of financial concerns. And we go out of our way to welcome people into our community, even though when you ask me, is their observance complete? We say no, their observance is not complete, but nobody's observance is totally and completely complete. And some of us don't observe Jewish law because we plain old can't. And Rabbi Lamm invokes this doctrine to help us explain the role of the homosexual in the Jewish tradition. Rabbi Lamm sees homosexuality as an aspect of incompleteness in a person. He refuses to move in a direction of contemporary thought that labels homosexuality proper. Rabbi Lamm is insistent that that is too hedonistic, but he's also steadfastly refuses to move in the direction of Rabbi Feinstein or Rabbi Soloveitchik, who labeled such conduct as out of the pale and such people have no place in our community. Rabbi Lamm was insistent here on a compromising position, and it's a very important compromising position. It's one that those of you who know my own writings know I deeply agree with, but it's an intellectual compromise that's somewhat dissatisfying. Rabbi Lamm says homosexuality is a conduct that violates traditional Jewish law, and we should never say anything else to the contrary. On the other hand, we need to be deeply committed to homosexual rights. He gets this right even in the 70s. We need to be deeply committed to the decriminalization of this conduct, and we need to be deeply committed to finding a place for the gay Orthodox Jew. Rabbi Lamm, consistent with what he says in A Hedge of Roses, is insistent that you make a profound mistake in reading the Jewish tradition to think that a focus on sexuality is the be-all and end-all of our life and purpose. In this regard, Rabbi Lamm is a skeptic of the Western moralities that starts in the 1960s, which defines people all around and exclusively about intimacy and sexuality. Rabbi Lamm doesn't deny that there is a place for intimacy and sexuality, and he doesn't deny that it's an important aspect of marital bliss, but Rabbi Lamm does deny that this should be the central focus of people, and he doesn't think that we should define people around sexuality unless they lay it out as a deep moral philosophy, which is what Rabbi Lamm thinks hedonism is. Hedonism is not a type of conduct. Hedonism is an ideology which says there is no God and I am here just for myself and I'm allowed to enjoy all the pleasures of the world of any type because there is no God and there is no world to come. That, Rabbi Lamm says, is deeply offensive to the Jewish tradition. But the idea that I have a sexual desire that's not permitted in Jewish law, Rabbi Lamm thinks, is part of the fact that we were all created somewhat sinful. And since we were all created somewhat sinful, we're a community full of sinful people in one way or another, and we welcome people in their sinfulness, and we even sometimes tolerate public sin, so long as the person who's advocating public sin, the person who's publicly sinning, doesn't advocate we should all be sinners and doesn't insist that it isn't a sin. Let me again give Rabbi Lamm the bonus points. The bonus points come from the fact that by 1970, Rabbi Lamm is one of the few people who's aware of the unique challenge we are confronting on the issue of homosexuality. There is little wiggle room in traditional Jewish law to permit homosexual behavior. And if we wish to run a community in which people who have homosexual desires nonetheless feel welcomed, Rabbi Lamm thinks we do it with what Michael Broyde will call second-tier techniques. And this is a very important contribution Rabbi Lamm makes. Rabbi Lamm recognizes that although the Jewish tradition has a robust view of sin, it has a diffuse and somewhat incoherent view of how to treat sinners. There's a train of rabbinic thought which says sinners should leave the community, but it's not the dominant view. There's a train of rabbinic thought which says sinners are welcomed in the community. There's a train of rabbinic thought which says even public sinners are welcomed in the community, and where the rabbinic tradition has its greatest flexibility is not in deciding whether this conduct is a sin or not. It's in deciding how we respond to people who are engaging in this sin. And Rabbi Lamm counsels in his article on homosexuality and halakha not to go crazy and not to seek to exclude people and not to see homosexuality as idol worship or a profound deviation from everything the Jewish tradition stands for, but instead to see it no different than the variety of sexual sins that have always been occasionally present in our community. People occasionally sexually sin, and this is an occasional sexual sin. We don't have a tradition of saying this is analogous to believing in multiple gods. And this is a very, very, very important deep contribution Rabbi Lamm wants to make here, which is hedonism, or the assertion that I'm put on this earth for my sexual pleasure, is a much more dynamic and profound attack on rabbinic Judaism than a person who says, I am looking for a stable monogamous partner, but I'm attracted to people of the same sex as me. Rabbi Lamm's point is that it's not that this is not a sin, but it's that a hedonistic orientation, as he notes in A Hedge of Roses, is the destruction of our community. Whereas a same-sex attraction confined to the basic models of non-promiscuous relationships poses a much lesser structural challenge. And that this is just an important real-world observation. So I get it. I think that Rabbi Lamm profoundly feels that the Jewish tradition is incredibly challenged by what I'll broadly label as homosexuality, as promiscuity. What Rabbi Lamm thinks is that the attitude of people who think that who I am intimate with is no more important than the color of my shirt, that poses a grand challenge to the Jewish tradition in a way that is hard to explain, but really undermines everything that we are talking about. I occasionally see this among my law students, which is when I teach family law, there is a sub-segment of law students who think that who they are intimate with reflects the same cafeteria-style menu choices as to what they eat. I'll try this, I'll try that. You go into a menu, a cafeteria every day, and there are 47 things on the menu. Eventually, you try them all out of a sense of it can't hurt to order it once. If you don't like it, you won't order it again. And hedonism is an argument that sexuality should be treated in that same way. And Rabbi Lamm's point is that that's the death of our community. Same-sex attraction is just an anomaly. It's a blip. It's not the defining characteristics of a person. It's just one deviation from the rabbinic tradition. And we have many and fine adequate tools. Rabbi Lamm uses the idea that people who are duressed are really exempt from the moral consequences of their action, but really he's comfortable with a variety of tools to express how the Jewish tradition should deal with your sexual orientation. Rabbi Lamm gets this balance right here. It's not at all about the sex. It's about finding a place to relate to God in your sexual relationships with another. So in A Hedge of Roses, Rabbi Lamm really takes aim at a philosophy of open marriage. Rabbi Lamm takes aim at a philosophy of sexual choice and variety. And in his article about homosexuality, he consciously chooses not to take aim at the people who have same-sex attraction, mostly because this is how they were created. You have to come to grips with it. It's not like promiscuity, which is something you can change. This is not something you can change. And I want to relate how Rabbi Lamm applied this in 5 different ways that I witnessed in my life. And then I'll voice a small critique. I'll voice a small critique in the most flattering but honest way that I can. Rabbi Lamm consistently proposed political compromise on same-sex marriage, on same-sex matters. When it came to the Israeli parade, Rabbi Lamm was the last of the Mohicans seeking compromise. Rabbi Lamm recognized that the bridge here was too great, and that if you didn't engage in compromise that was principled but yet compromising, you were going to schism the community. And he paid a price for it. He told me once that he paid a price for it. I told him once that I received a lot of hate mail when I wrote something that was in favor of gay rights. And Rabbi Lamm looked at me and smiled and said, I received much more hate mail than you. I wasn't sure it was correct because I received a lot of hate mail, but a compromise here generates criticisms from both extremes. And yet Rabbi Lamm believed in the political compromise between orthodoxy and the same-sex movement. The second thing Rabbi Lamm believed very intensely, and he said this to me a few times, although I'm not aware that he wrote it, is that promiscuity poses a much greater threat than same-sex relationships, and that he was bothered in Yeshiva University much more by promiscuity than by same-sex relationships. He told that to me directly. Rabbi Lamm was in his heart and in his feet a political liberal. And this was very important, or maybe you could call him a political libertarian. He was against government regulation and criminalization in the name of morality. When I wrote this in 1993, he wrote me a note in which he said that this was the right approach and that we should not seek government regulation of morality, and that ultimately government regulation of morality would redound to our discredit. Rabbi Lamm thought, not aware of him ever putting it in writing, but I heard it from him directly, that the dissolution of family structure through not divorce, but the incessant belief that all marriages were temporary and that people got married for a few years and then they got divorced. And that people didn't enter into marriage even with the hope and idea that their marriages would last forever, posed a very, very, very serious challenge to the Jewish tradition, much more so than people who had same-sex attractions. I remember Rabbi Lamm saying to me that the greatest threat posed to the structure of family in our community was, and I've used this analogy myself many times, the people who thought their marriages were like their cars, which is they bought one, used it for a few years, and traded it in for the next model that was better. Rabbi Lamm wasn't hostile to divorce. I once went to speak to him about a divorce matter, and he said, divorce is part of marriage. It's important to recognize people get divorced. But Rabbi Lamm's point is that people aspire in their marriages to stay married. And he thought the culture of temporary marriages or marriages for a few years was exactly the hedonism that he was writing so intensely about in A Hedge of Roses. Now I'll voice a word of criticism from a loving student, and then I'll explain why Rabbi Lamm didn't agree with me. And then I'll explain why I think I'm correct. I hope you'll excuse me for doing all of this. Rabbi Lamm didn't see the political challenges that the same-sex community would ultimately come to pose to religious life in America. And in a few different moments, he diminished those challenges. In his defense, and I want to say it very forcefully, Rabbi Lamm essentially retired from public life in 2013, when maybe very prescient people could see that this was coming. But by the time Rabbi Lamm retired, he was already somewhat frail. And in his defense, I can't blame him for not being a prescient 85-year-old. I'm hardly a prescient 56-year-old. Rabbi Lamm was prescient until he was 75 or 80. And if he stopped being prescient in his mid-80s, I can forgive him for that. But some of what Rabbi Lamm wrote in the 70s, I feel didn't adequately predict the future of the year 2020. Now, that's hardly a criticism, because I doubt they're going to read anything I wrote 50 years after I wrote it. So to say that some of Rabbi Lamm's writings on homosexuality miss a topic that has come to the forefront of American life 50 years after he wrote it is hardly a criticism. We can reasonably ask our leaders to be right in their era, but we have a hard time asking our leaders to be right for an era that they're already not leading in. But nonetheless, in the 70s, Rabbi Lamm made predictions about where the same-sex attraction agenda would go, which by 50 years later had proven, I think, not correct. I can easily forgive him for not being a prophet. Rabbi Lamm was shrewd but not prophetic. And that's better than me. I'm neither shrewd nor prophetic. So Rabbi Lamm's lack of prophetic ability hardly diminishes from him in any way. So we'll stop here, and I want to make a few points. Rabbi Lamm is an underrated Jewish philosopher. He was the grandest philosopher of the last half of the 20th century and gets the challenges posed by the 1960s and onward distinctly right. He understands that hedonism is the challenge of the last half of the 20th and the first half of the 21st century. He is mistaken in not putting same-sex attractions in that same basket, but we can forgive him for that small error. What he gets right is that hedonism is a challenge to the Jewish community greater than the Christian tradition is in our present times. And Rabbi Lamm distinctly rises to that challenge and tries to address how the Jewish tradition should respond to hedonism as early as 1966. I would have made Rabbi Lamm the president of Yeshiva University based just on the book A Hedge of Roses, That alone is a book that entitles you to lead our community. It's a thin little book. It's 100 pages. You can buy it for under $10 on Amazon, and I think you can buy the Kindle version for $4. It's worth reading and buying to understand the great mind Rabbi Lamm had.